you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guest Phil. Undoubtedly, you've all been affected by the recession in some way, shape, or form, whether that be through a change in your job situation, or perhaps it's seeing your investments lose value, or just the uneasy feeling that you get without knowing, with an uncertain future. Many economists have called this recession the biggest since the Great Depression. And our own chief investment officer at my company recently wrote in a commentary about the tremendous stimulus that has been put forth to try to get us out of this recession. And he compared it to what we've done in previous instances, and it's 3.5 times as big as that stimulus that was put forth to combat the Great Depression, and about 11 times greater than the average response to past recessions that we've had in the post-World War II era. And he goes on to say that you can really only conclude two things from this. Either A, our policymakers are completely off their rocker and they've way overreacted to a problem that isn't quite that severe, or B, the authorities knew that this recession and the credit crisis that we had leading up to it had the potential to take us into something as severe or worse than the Great Depression, and he believes it was the latter. And that's a pretty powerful statement when you say that we had the potential to head into another Great Depression. And I remember learning about the Great Depression in history class in high school and stories that my grandfather would tell us, but I never really paid attention to it because those, were my teenage years, and you just didn't care about those things. You only cared about what was going on tonight or tomorrow or whatever. But with my job, I constantly get asked, is this going to be another Great Depression? And I think to better answer those questions and calm those concerns of clients, I've been forced to become somewhat knowledgeable on this subject in the last 12 months. And to understand the Depression, you first need to understand the events leading up to it. The 1920s, the Roaring 20s, were a period of great prosperity, fueled in part by a credit boom, which was basically people borrowing too much money to live lifestyles beyond their means, very similar to what we had leading up until this credit crisis. And part of the way that they did that was they also, we also had a tremendous stock market during that same period of time. And part of the way that they tried to even maximize their situation even further was to buy stocks on margin. That simply meant to buy $1 worth of stock, you only had to put 10 cents up of your money, the other 90 cents was borrowed. And that is great when the market is doing well because it magnifies your returns tenfold. It also magnifies the risk tenfold. And eventually in '29, the stock market started to go down. Those margins were called. People had to sell more stock, and it was throwing fuel to an already burning fire. And you had the crash of '29, which was kind of the first domino to fall that set the chain of events in motion that led to the Great Depression. After that sudden shock to the system, people were concerned. They pulled money out of their banks. They defaulted on loans. Banks began to fail, which created even more widespread panic. And you eventually began the downward death spiral that took it to where it finally bottomed out in 1932, which ended up being an unemployment rate of 25%, stock market decline of approximately 80%. You had manufacturing output that was cut in half. 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had completely gone under. And back in those days when a bank failed, depositors, literally, they lost their money. You didn't have FDIC insurance at that time. Eventually, the jobless became the homeless, and you had these little communities that would sprout out on the outskirts of some of the hardest hit industrial areas. They were called Hoovervilles, and I have a couple of pictures of what these look like. They were communities of shacks or shanties made of cardboard, scrap lumber, tar paper, whatever you could get your hands on to essentially create some shelter for you. And they were named after the president at the time, I guess over the frustration that they had that the policies that they were employing were not working for them. And you had widespread disease. Children were pulled out of school to help out their families as much as they could. Soup lines, bread lines were common. Obesity was not an issue back then. Let's talk about obesity today. If you ever look at pictures of the Depression era, everybody was thin, skinny. So, but it was a very desperate situation. Up until the Depression, it was expected that governments would stay out of the economy and market forces would correct themselves. That philosophy basically was replaced by voting in FDR, who brought in the New Deal and an alphabet soup of government programs and agencies meant to combat the Depression at that time. Some of it which worked, some of it did not work, and some of it is still around today. Social Security was created in 1935 to help end poverty among the elderly population. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created to insure bank deposits, which creates more stability in the banking industry. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was set up to regulate stock trading. Now, for example, you can only margin 50 cents on the dollar versus 10 cents on the dollar. So when people ask me that question, I usually respond with, I don't think so, the question of are we heading for another Great Depression? And the reason is I take comfort in the fact that our policymakers are have learned from the history. Ben Bernanke, for instance, is considered an authority on the Great Depression. Our response has been more robust and it's been quicker than what took place during the Great Depression. In addition, programs such as Social Security, unemployment insurance, FDIC insurance, all of those are stabilitative factors that weren't in existence back during that time. So the question I think that we really need to ask is not, is this going to be a Great Depression, but what kind of problems are we going to be creating for ourselves in the future with all the stimulus that we're putting forth today, and only time will tell. Thank you.